Welcome back to Charles Paris Mysteries. Tonight, we leave the real world behind and step into the soundproofed, claustrophobic world of a budget audiobook studio. It is a place where the air is recycled, the silence costs £200 an hour, and where the only thing cheaper than the budget is the loyalty of the cast. This mystery is an affectionate homage to the style of Simon Brett, but the twist is entirely our own. Here is a question for you tonight. Have you ever had to finish a task that someone else started, only to realize exactly why they quit? Maybe a project at work, or a DIY disaster. Let me know in the comments. Your stories help fuel the atmosphere here. So, before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps keep Charles in whiskey. Now, pour yourself a large Bell's, turn down the lights, and let's raise the curtain on Dead on the Mic. Chapter 1. Hereford Road, Unabridged Despair. The bedsit in Hereford Road possessed a climate entirely its own, distinct from the weather outside and largely indifferent to the laws of thermodynamics. On this particular Tuesday in November, the room had achieved a damp, pervasive chill that seemed to settle in the marrow of the bones, a cold that woolen jumpers could not repel and gas fires could only mock. Charles Paris sat on the edge of his bed, wrapped in a dressing gown that had seen better decades, staring at the coin-operated gas meter. It stared back with the impassive hostility of a sphinx. He had 50p in his pocket. He also had a desire for toast. The meter, however, was a jealous god. It demanded sacrifice before it would grant the small miracle of a blue flame. Charles sighed, the sound a plume of white vapour in the frigid air. He was resting. He had been resting for 3 months, ever since his brief and undistinguished appearance as a corpse in a police procedural had been cut for time. Since then, his artistic output had been limited to rehearsing excuses for the landlord and performing the role of man who is not in debt whenever he visited the local newsagent. The phone rang. The sound was startling in the silence, a shrill, mechanical intrusion that made Charles jump. He stared at the device. It could be anyone. It could be the BBC offering a lead in a new, bleak dystopian drama. It could be the Royal Shakespeare Company. It could be, and most likely was, someone trying to sell him a conservatory he had nowhere to put. He picked up the receiver, adopting his best, just stepped out of a shower after a rigorous squash game voice. Charles Paris speaking. "Charles! Dear boy!" The voice was brisk, fruity, and undeniably that of Maurice Skellen. Maurice, an agent whose incompetence was matched only by his optimism, sounded as though he were calling from the deck of a yacht rather than his chaotic office in Soho. "Maurice," Charles said, his tone dropping a semitone to indicate guarded availability. "I was just looking over a script. What can I do for you?" "Lunch, Charles." "Lunch?" "I'm at the trattoria. Get yourself down here. Something's come up. Something big." "Big?" Charles asked, skepticism warring with the sudden, sharp pang of hunger. "Enormous. A marathon, Charles. A veritable odyssey of the vocal cords. Get a cab. I'll pay." Charles did not get a cab. He walked to the tube station, fighting the wind that whipped down Queensway, and arrived at the restaurant 20 minutes later, slightly flushed and pretending that the walk had been a lifestyle choice. Maurice was already seated, a large gin and tonic, glowing amber in his hand. He looked, as always, like a man who had just successfully sold a bridge to a tourist. "Charles." "Sit, sit. You look wonderfully rustic. Very authentic." "Cold," Charles corrected, sliding into the booth. "I look cold, Maurice." "Nonsense. You have the glow of the creatively unoccupied. Now, drink? A glass of the house red, perhaps?" "Make it a bottle," Maurice told the waiter, waving a hand with the largesse of a man spending his commission before he'd earned it. "And I'll have the prawn cocktail and the steak and chips. Rare. Blood on the plate." Charles looked at the menu. The prices seemed to have been adjusted for inflation since he last ate here, which was approximately never. "I'll have the soup of the day," Charles said modestly, "and perhaps some bread." Maurice rolled his eyes. "Suit yourself. Now to business." He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that carried easily to the 3 nearest tables. You know Sir Julian Vane? The Sir Julian Vane? Charles asked. National treasure? Voice like melted chocolate poured over gravel? The very same. Well, tragic business. Taken unwell. Serious? Terminal. For the schedule, Morris said, spearing a prawn. He was recording the definitive biography of Archibald Pringle. Pringle? Victorian administrator. Fascinating chap, apparently. Invented the filing cabinet divider or something, equally structural. 600 pages of unadulterated history. Sir Julian was halfway through. Then Maurice made a vague gesture that implied a collapse of both health and professional standards. He couldn't continue. The publisher is frantic. The studio is booked. They need a voice, Charles. A voice with gravitas. A voice with experience. A voice that is available immediately and won't ask for Sir Julian's fee. Charles felt the familiar prickle of humiliation. He wasn't being hired for his talent. He was being hired because he was cheap, available, and possessed a larynx that hadn't yet been pickled into silence. They want me to replace Sir Julian Vane? Finish the job, dear boy. Pick up the baton. They've got a deadline. They need someone who can go into the booth, read for 8 hours a day, and not trip over words like sesquicentennial or bureaucratic obfuscation. And the fee? Maurice named a sum. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't even a small treasure. But it was enough to feed the gas meter for a year. It was enough to pay the rent. It was enough to buy a bottle of Bell's that didn't have to be nursed like a sickly child. I'll take it, Charles said, watching Maurice devour his steak with the enthusiasm of a cannibal. Excellent, Maurice beamed. I told them you were resting. I said, Charles is selective, but for a project of this magnitude, I think I can twist his arm. I knew you'd see the artistic merit. The artistic merit of Archibald Pringle's filing cabinets, Charles said dryly. Exactly. Immortality, Charles. Your voice, preserved forever in digital format, educating the masses on the history of administrative organization. It's what we got into the business for, isn't it? Charles didn't answer. He dipped a piece of bread into his lukewarm soup and thought about Sir Julian Vane. A national treasure. A man who could read the telephone directory and make it sound like Shakespeare. And now Charles was to be his understudy, the patch-up job, the polyfiller in the crack of a masterpiece. He finished his soup. He watched Maurice finish his steak. He watched Maurice order a coffee and a brandy. You'll need to be at the studio tomorrow at 9, Maurice said, wiping his mouth with a napkin. Sharp. They're very particular about time. Money is tight, apparently. Which reminds me. He pulled a calculator out of his pocket. I'll just deduct my 15% from the advance now, shall I? Save the paperwork. Charles walked out of the restaurant into the biting cold of Soho. He had a job. He was no longer resting. He was a working actor. He was about to become the voice of a dead Victorian bureaucrat. He turned the collar of his coat up against the wind. He needed to prepare. He needed to warm up his vocal cords. He needed to numb the small, nagging voice in his head that said he was merely the debris used to fill a hole left by a titan. He pushed open the door of the first pub he saw. The air inside was warm, smelling of stale beer and damp coats. It was a smell that promised, if not happiness, then at least a temporary suspension of reality. He walked to the bar. The barman looked at him, eyebrows raised. A large Bell's, Charles said. He took the glass, watched the golden liquid swirl, and raised a toast to Archibald Pringle. May his filing cabinets be eternal, and may the cheque clear. Chapter 2. The Booth, the Legend. The recording facility was located in a part of London that had been aggressively gentrified to the point of sterility. It was a building of glass and brushed steel, the sort of place that housed architectural firms, graphic design agencies, and other businesses that dealt in the expensive intangible. Charles pushed through the heavy glass doors and found himself in a reception area that seemed designed to suppress the human spirit. The carpet was thick, grey, and sound-absorbent, swallowing his footsteps as if he were a ghost. The air smelled of ionized dust and the kind of expensive coffee that is never actually offered to visitors. Behind a desk that looked like the control panel of a spaceship sat a receptionist. She was young, severe, and possessed the unique ability to type furiously without ever looking at her fingers or acknowledging the existence of the person standing in front of her. "Charles Paris," Charles said, projecting slightly. "Here for the Pringle biography." The receptionist stopped typing. She looked up, her gaze travelling over Charles's coat, which was undeniably High Street, and his shoes, which were undeniably veteran. "Studio 3, she said, her voice flat. "Down the corridor. Turn left at the platinum disc. If you see the gold disc, you've gone too far." Charles thanked her, though he wasn't sure why, and made his way down the hushed hallway. The walls were lined with framed posters of audiobooks the studio had produced, memoirs of footballers who hadn't read them, cookery books read by people who had never boiled an egg, and thrillers, where the gun on the cover was embossed in silver foil. Studio 3 was at the end of the corridor. Charles pushed the heavy soundproof door and stepped into the airlock, then through the second door into the control room. It was a cave of technology. Banks of sliders, screens displaying scrolling waveforms, and a coffee machine that hissed with menacing intent. 3 people were already there, and the atmosphere was tense enough to snap a violin string. "Ah," said the woman standing near the producer's desk. She looked exhausted. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she was clutching a clipboard as if it were a shield. "You must be the contingency." "Charles Paris," Charles said, extending a hand. "The replacement—" "Sheila," she said, not taking the hand. "I'm the producer for the publisher. We're running behind." Sitting at the mixing desk was a man who looked as if he hadn't seen natural light since the mid-90s. He wore a black T-shirt, black jeans, and had a pair of headphones around his neck like a stethoscope. This, presumably, was the engineer. He didn't look up. He was staring at a decibel meter with the intensity of a bomb disposal expert. "Ken," Sheila said, gesturing to the engineer. "And that's Toby." Toby was a young man in the corner, holding a stopwatch, and looking like he wanted to be literally anywhere else on Earth. "Right," Charles said, rubbing his hands together. "Shall I get set up? I've had a look at the text. Pringle's early years are dry, but I think I can bring a certain pathos to the Sewage Reform Act." Sheila exchanged a look with Ken. It was the sort of look parents exchange when a child asks where puppies come from. "Actually, Mr. Paris," Sheila said, "there's been a slight development. Sir Julian has arrived." Charles stopped. "I thought he was ill." "He is," said a voice from the doorway behind him, "but he is also a professional." Charles turned. Standing there, leaning heavily on a silver-topped cane, was Sir Julian Vane. He looked terrible. His skin was the colour of parchment, his eyes were sunken, and he was sweating with a sheen that suggested a fever fighting a losing battle against ego. But he was undeniably Sir Julian Vane. He wore a velvet scarf, a camel coat, and an expression of imperious suffering. "Sir Julian," Charles said, instinctively straightening up. "I was told." That I had croaked? Sir Julian's voice was a magnificent instrument, a cello played in a cathedral. Even wheezing, it had gravitas. Premature, dear boy. Very premature. "I have a contract. I have a reputation. And I have never left a job unfinished." He shuffled into the room, bringing with him the smell of old lavender water and sickness. He looked at Charles with a flicker of recognition that vanished instantly. "And you are?" "Charles Paris. I was called in to—" "Ah." "The understudy," Sir Julian said. The word hung in the air, dripping with velvet disdain. How charming. Ideally, I would have preferred someone with a bit more weight. But I suppose at short notice one takes what one can find from the casting directory's bargain bin. Charles felt his smile freeze. "I was actually going to—" "Fetch me a water, there's a good chap," Sir Julian said, dismissing him with a wave of a trembling hand. "Room temperature. No ice. Ice constricts the vocal cords. But you wouldn't know that, I suppose, doing the sort of work you do." He turned his back on Charles and faced the producer. "Sheila, darling, I am ready. The throat is a little scratchy, but the spirit is willing. Let us get this damned Pringle buried once and for all. Sheila looked terrified. Sir Julian, are you sure? The doctor said. The doctor is a mechanic of the flesh, Sir Julian boomed, then broke into a hacking cough that sounded like a bag of gravel being shaken. He recovered, wiping his mouth with a silk handkerchief. I am an artist of the soul. Let's go. Sir Julian marched, or rather lurched, towards the booth. The heavy glass door sealed him in. Charles stood there, the understudy, holding his own coat. You can sit on the sofa, Ken the engineer said, finally acknowledging his presence. Just don't breathe too loud. The mic picks up everything. I'm running a high-gain compression on him to hide the wheeze. Charles sat. The sofa was leather, low, and uncomfortable. Through the glass window, he watched Sir Julian Vane arrange himself on the stool. The famous actor adjusted the microphone stand, glared at the pop shield, and produced a small tin of lozenges from his pocket. He placed them on the script stand with ritualistic precision, alongside a strange, small, humidifying device he had pulled from his bag. Rolling, Ken said into the talkback mic. Chapter 12. Pringle at the Board of Trade. Take one. Inside the booth, Sir Julian closed his eyes. He took a breath, and then he began to read. It was annoying, Charles thought, just how good he was. Despite the illness, despite the sweat running down his forehead, Sir Julian's voice was hypnotic. He turned the dry prose of Victorian administration into a saga. He made a debate about filing cabinets sound like the Trojan War. He caressed the vowels and hit the consonants with percussive precision. The accumulation of paperwork, Sir Julian read, his voice rolling like thunder, was, to Pringle, not a burden, but a fortification against chaos. Cut, Sheila said into the talkback. Sir Julian, that was lovely, but could we pick it up from fortification? I heard a little click. Sir Julian's eyes snapped open behind the glass. He pressed the talkback button in the booth. A click? I do not click, Sheila. I articulate. It was just a mouth noise, Sir Julian, Ken said, his hand hovering over the equalizer. We can edit it, but a clean take is better. Mouth noise, Sir Julian repeated, the words dripping with scorn. I am giving you gold, and you are complaining about the wrapper. Very well. From fortification. But be quick. I do not have all day, and this booth smells of damp foam. Charles watched, fascinated and appalled. He saw the way Sheila flinched every time Sir Julian paused too long. He saw the way the rights representative, a nervous man in a suit who had slipped in quietly, was checking his watch, calculating the cost of every second. He also noticed something else. Sir Julian was struggling more than he let on. Between takes, the great actor's face would go slack, the mask dropping to reveal a terrifying exhaustion. He would reach for his water with a hand that shook violently, or pop one of his lozenges with a desperate urgency. He's not going to make it, Charles thought, with a mixture of professional concern and the dark, involuntary hope of the understudy. He's going to collapse before he gets to the Reform Act of 1867. Charles? Charles looked up. Sheila was whispering to him, shielding her mouth so Sir Julian couldn't see through the glass. Don't go far, she murmured. Please. He's pushing it. We need you on standby. Literally. If he stops, you jump in. We have to finish this book by Friday, or we lose the slot. I'm here, Charles whispered back, resting, as ever. Good. She looked back at the glass. And, sorry about the water comment, he's just a national treasure, Charles said. We must preserve him. We must preserve the recording, Sheila corrected, her eyes hard. The treasure is replaceable. The deadline isn't. Inside the booth, Sir Julian Vane coughed again, a wet, heavy sound that the high-gain microphone amplified into an explosion in the control room speakers. Ken winced and adjusted a dial. Take two, Ken droned. And try to keep the phlegm to a minimum, Sir Julian. Charles settled back into the leather sofa. The air in the control room was warm and smelled of burnt coffee. Through the glass, the aquarium light of the booth illuminated Sir Julian Vane, a dying king in a soundproof box, fighting a battle against his own biology for the sake of a contract. Charles thought about the immortality Maurice had spoken of. It looked exhausting. He closed his eyes and thought of a large Bell's whiskey. That, at least, was a legacy he could understand. Chapter 3. A Bad Take. The session ground on with the glacial inevitability of the Victorian bureaucracy it described. For 2 hours, Sir Julian Vane wrestled with the life of Archibald Pringle, a man who appeared to have expressed every emotion he ever felt through the medium of a memorandum. Charles sat on the leather sofa, nursing a plastic cup of lukewarm water, and feeling his own artistic soul withering in sympathy. Beside him, the rights representative, a man named Nigel, whose suit was sharper than his intellect, was practically vibrating with anxiety. Every time Sir Julian paused to inhale, Nigel checked his watch. "He's slowing down," Nigel whispered, his voice tight. "He's 5 pages behind the schedule. At this rate, we'll hit the overtime penalty at 4 o'clock. "He is dying," Charles pointed out helpfully. "Or at least giving a very convincing performance of a man whose lungs are resigning in protest." "He's under contract," Nigel snapped, as if bacteria were subject to legal proceedings. Inside the booth, Sir Julian stopped. He didn't wait for the engineer to cut. He simply ceased speaking, leaving a sentence about colonial timber exports hanging in the air like a suicide note. "I need," Sir Julian announced, his voice booming through the monitors, "a moment. The atmosphere in here is thinner than a politician's promise." "We're on a roll, Sir Julian," Sheila said, her voice trembling slightly. "Just another few pages, and we can break for." "I said a moment." Sir Julian ripped the headphones off. He grabbed his cane and shoved the heavy door open. The sound of his breathing filled the control room instantly, a wet, rattling rasp that made Charles instinctively recoil. The great actor didn't look at the production team. He marched slowly, painfully out into the corridor. Nigel hesitated for a second, then shot up and followed him, closing the door behind them. Through the soundproof glass of the control room window, Charles could see them in the corridor. It was like watching a silent movie. Sir Julian was leaning against the wall, face purple with exertion or rage. Nigel was gesticulating, holding up a finger, perhaps citing a clause. Sir Julian struck the floor with his cane, his mouth moving in what was clearly a series of 4-letter words that Archibald Pringle would never have committed to paper. "What's that about?" Charles asked. Sheila rubbed her temples. "Money. It's always money. Or billing. Sir Julian wants his name above the title. Nigel says the author's name has to come first. It's a biography, for God's sake." "Vanity," Charles murmured. "The only fuel that burns cleaner than alcohol." The argument in the corridor ended abruptly. Sir Julian pushed Nigel aside and stormed back into the room. He looked worse, if that were possible. His skin was grey, his lips practically blue. "Let us finish this," Sir Julian snarled, bypassing the sofa and heading straight for the booth. "I will not be dictated to by an accountant in a polyester blend." He slammed the booth door. He sat heavily on the stool. He reached for his personal humidifier, a sleek black device that puffed a constant stream of mist into the dry air and turned the dial up. He popped another lozenge into his mouth, grimacing as he swallowed. "Rolling," Ken said, his hand hovering over the record button. Chapter 13. The Timber Crisis. Sir Julian took a breath. It sounded like a saw cutting through wet wood. "The question of the timber," he began, the famous voice wavering. He stopped. He frowned, looking at the script as if the words were rearranging themselves. "Sir Julian?" Sheila asked. The letters," Sir Julian mumbled. His hand went to his throat. "The letters are wrong." And then he simply tipped over. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the flailing, curtain-clutching death of a Shakespearean tragedy. It was the heavy, dull slump of dead weight. His head hit the script stand, sending pages flying like startled doves, and then he slid sideways off the stool. The thud, captured by the high-sensitivity Neumann microphone, came through the speakers with a bass-heavy finality that shook the control room floor. "Jesus!" Ken shouted, ripping his headphones off. Sheila screamed, a short, sharp sound that was immediately swallowed by the acoustic tiling. They scrambled. The door to the booth was yanked open. Charles was the third one in, hovering uselessly in the doorway while Sheila and Nigel knelt beside the fallen giant. The air inside the booth was hot, humid, and smelled intensely of menthol and something else, something bitter, like almonds, or perhaps just old electrical wiring. "He's not breathing," Sheila said, her voice high and thin. "Ken, call an ambulance. He's not breathing." Sir Julian Vane, the voice of the Royal Shakespeare Company, the narrator of 1,000 documentaries, lay curled on the anti-static carpet. His eyes were open, staring fixedly at the underside of the microphone stand. He looked smaller than he had on screen. Death had already begun the process of editing him down to size. The police arrived with the casual slowness of people who know there is no rush. 2 uniformed officers, followed by a plainclothes detective who looked like he'd been hoping for a bank robbery and was disappointed to find a cardiac arrest. They took statements. They looked at Sir Julian's age, 74. They looked at his medical history, spectacularly poor. They looked at the stress of the recording schedule. "Natural causes, almost certainly," the detective said, closing his notebook with a snap. "Heart gave out. Happens. Especially under lights. Hot in there." The body was wheeled away on a gurney, covered by a sheet that looked suspiciously like a sound blanket. Nigel was already on his phone in the corridor, talking in hushed, urgent tones about insurance contingencies and release dates. The control room emptied out. Sheila went to find tea, or gin, or a priest. Ken went to have a cigarette. Charles remained. He stepped back into the booth. It was empty now, save for the equipment. The silence was absolute. He looked at the stool where Sir Julian had died. He looked at the script, scattered on the floor. And then he saw it. It was a small thing. A triviality. The sort of detail that a policeman looking for a weapon or a wound would miss entirely. The humidifier was still puffing away, sending a thin stream of mist into the dead air. But next to it, on the little shelf Sir Julian had used for his personal effects, was the wrapper of the lozenge he had taken just moments before he died. Charles picked it up. It wasn't the same brand as the tin Sir Julian had placed on the desk earlier. The tin was Fisherman's Friend. This wrapper was silver, unbranded, generic. Charles frowned. He looked at the mixing desk through the glass. The equipment was in standby mode, lights blinking rhythmically. He remembered the moment of death. He remembered the sound. But he also remembered something else. Just as Sir Julian had started to choke, just as his hand had gone to his throat, the red record light on the console, the tally light that signalled the machine was rolling, had flickered off. For a split second. Then it had come back on. It was a punch-in. In audio terms, a punch-in is when you overwrite a mistake. You roll back the tape, or the digital file, play up to the error, and then hit record to slot in the new line seamlessly. But nobody had been touching the desk. Ken had been watching the levels. If the light had flickered, it meant the machine had received a command. An automated command? Or a remote one? Charles looked at the humidifier again. He leaned in and sniffed the mist. The smell of bitter almonds was faint, almost masked by the menthol, but it was there. Sir Julian Vane hadn't just died of a heart attack. He had been edited out. Charles felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He turned and walked out of the booth, slipping the silver lozenge wrapper into his pocket. He needed a drink. And for once, it wasn't just to numb the boredom. It was to help him swallow the uncomfortable truth that he was now the lead actor in a murder mystery, and he hadn't even seen the script. Chapter 4. Pub Notes, Voice Lessons. The pub nearest the recording studio was called The Soundboard, a name that promised industry chic but delivered only a carpet that smelled of damp Labrador and a fruit machine that played a demonic chiptune version of The Final Countdown every 11 minutes. It was the sort of establishment where tragedy went to decompose. Following the departure of the ambulance and the police, the production team had drifted there with the migratory instinct of lemmings seeking a cliff, or in this case, a Pinot Grigio. Charles Paris joined them, partly because he was now technically part of the team, but mostly because he sensed that in the aftermath of sudden death, alcohol acts as a truth serum. He located Sheila, Ken, and Nigel huddled in a booth upholstered in a fabric that was likely flame-retardant but definitely not stain-resistant. "A tragic loss," Charles said, sliding into the booth with the practiced ease of a man who has inserted himself into wake drinks for people he barely knew. "A titan. Felled." "A nightmare," Sheila corrected, staring into a large glass of white wine as if hoping to find a new career at the bottom of it. "Do you know how much the studio cancellation fee is? Do you?" "I imagine it is substantial," Charles murmured soothingly. "Can I get anyone, crisps?" "He was going to sue us," Nigel blurted out. The rights representative was drinking a lager with a frantic, piston-like motion. "Did you hear him in the corridor? He said he knew about the creative accounting on the royalty splits." Charles's ears, tuned to the frequency of scandal, pricked up. He adopted his most solicitous expression, the one he used when playing a sympathetic vicar in a soap opera. "Surely not," Charles said. "Sir Julian? Interested in money?" "Obsessed," Nigel hissed. He'd seen the pre-order figures. He knew the publisher was hiding the digital projection numbers to keep his bonus tier low. He threatened to blow the whistle. He said he'd stop recording until we renegotiated. "And then he died," Ken said from the corner of the booth. The engineer was nursing a pint of stout and looking bored. "Problem solved, Nige?" Nigel went pale. "Don't say that. Don't even joke. The police called it natural causes." "Heart attack," Sheila said firmly. He was 74. He ate cheese like it was an apple. It was a ticking time bomb. Charles nodded sagely while his mind raced. So, the National Treasure wasn't just a difficult artist. He was a financial liability. A man who was worth more dead and edited than alive. And litigious. "It's strange, though," Charles ventured, testing the waters. "The timing. Just as he was reading about the, what was it? The timber crisis? He was always stopping there," Ken said. "Hated that chapter. Said the prose was lumpy. He kept trying to rewrite it. Rewriting Pringle. Can you imagine?" "He was rewriting more than the prose," Nigel muttered into his beer. Charles leaned in. "Oh?" "He was claiming the biography was a whitewash," Nigel said, lowering his voice. "He said he'd found letters in the archives. Said Pringle wasn't just dull, he was corrupt. Sir Julian wanted to include them. Make it a revelation. The publisher said absolutely not. The estate has final approval. We're paid to print the legend, not the embezzlement." Charles digested this. A dull biography that concealed a century-old crime, and a narrator who wanted to expose it while also demanding a bigger cut of the profits. It was a messy, human tangle of greed and ego. The sort of tangle that usually ended with a lawyer's letter, but occasionally, just occasionally, ended with a coroner's report. Charles decided it was time for a moment of profundity. He cleared his throat, preparing to deliver a monologue on the sanctity of the human voice, the way an actor breathes life into the dust of history, and how death cannot silence the recorded word. "You know," Charles began, his voice dropping an octave for effect, "it makes one realize the terrible fragility of our craft. We are but vessels. We pour our souls into the microphone, hoping to leave a trace, a ghost in the machine that speaks long after we are." He stopped. A tickle, sharp and sudden, clawed at the back of his throat. He tried to swallow it. "Long after we are gone," he managed. Before the tickle became a spasm, he coughed. It was a dry, hacking sound, remarkably similar to the one Sir Julian had made, though presumably less fatal. "You all right, mate?" Ken asked, unmoved. "Dust," Charles wheezed, his eyes watering. "Studio dust, dry as a cough. Bone." He took a sip of Nigel's lager without asking, grimacing at the taste. The moment of gravitas had collapsed, as it always did for Charles, into physical farce. He wasn't a philosopher-detective. He was a middle-aged actor with a scratchy throat and an overdraft. "You'd better be careful," Sheila said, looking at him critically. "You're starting tomorrow, 9 a.m. We're using Sir Julian's files for the first half, but you have to match his tone for the rest. If you lose your voice, I will personally kill you. I shall be... cough." "Fine," Charles rasped. "I just need the appropriate lubrication." He stood up, regaining a shred of dignity by smoothing down his coat. "I'm going to the bar," he announced. "This is research. Purely medicinal." He navigated the sticky carpet to the bar, where the landlord was staring glumly at a pump handle. "A large Bell's," Charles said, his voice returning to its normal register as the prospect of whiskey drew near. He watched the golden liquid pour. It was amber, the colour of preserved history. He thought about the silver lozenge wrapper in his pocket. He thought about the red light that had flickered on the console. Sir Julian Vane had been silenced, but the audio remained. And if there was one thing Charles knew about bad performances, it was that you could always hear the edit if you listened hard enough. He took a sip. The whiskey burned. A pleasant, familiar fire. To Archibald Pringle, Charles whispered to the fruit machine. And his timber. The machine flashed 3 lemons and played a losing jingle. Charles took it as a sign. Chapter 5. Muswell Hill, Normality. Muswell Hill differs from the rest of London in that it believes, with a quiet, persistent fervour, that nothing bad should ever really happen. It is a land of tree-lined avenues, Edwardian facades, and residents who regard the concept of a scene as something one should avoid making in public. Charles Paris arrived at the house he still technically owned, though he possessed the keys only in the sense that a museum guard possesses the keys to the exhibit case's access, but no ownership. The house was warm. It smelled of floor polish, books, and the terrifying scent of organised living. Frances was in the kitchen. She was sitting at the pine table, surrounded by piles of exercise books, a glass of red wine, and an aura of competence that made Charles feel instantly like a truant schoolboy. "Hello, Charles," she said, without looking up from a particularly savage red pen correction of a Year 9 essay. "I assume the resting has reached the critical phase where you need a hot meal." "I have a job, actually," Charles said, trying to sound as if this were a regular occurrence rather than a statistical anomaly. "A major recording, taking over from Sir Julian Vane." Frances paused. She put the pen down and looked at him. Her gaze was cool, analytical, and entirely immune to his charm. "Taking over? I heard on the radio he died. This afternoon." "Yes," Charles said, moving towards the fridge with the homing instinct of a starving animal. "Tragic. I was there. Or rather, I was in the next room, waiting to be his understudy." "You were understudying a 74-year-old man reading a biography of a civil servant?" "Archibald Pringle was a titan of administration, Francis. And yes, it pays." He found a dish of shepherd's pie covered in cling film. It looked like salvation. He put it in the microwave, the hum of the machine filling the silence. "So," Frances said, picking up her wine, "you're stepping into dead shoes. Again. You do have a habit of finding work in the obituary columns." "It's a living," Charles said defensively. "Anyway, it's odd. The death." "Odd how? He was old? He smoked? I imagine his arteries looked like the M25 on a Friday." "The timing," Charles said, leaning against the counter as the microwave dinged. He retrieved the pie and found a fork. He was arguing about money. Then he goes into the booth, takes a sweet, and drops dead. But just before he died, the red light went off. The red light? The recording light. The tally. It flickered. Someone stopped the recording, or punched in, right at the moment of death. It's technically inconsistent. Frances sighed. She took a sip of wine. "Charles, you are doing it again." "Doing what?" "Turning a sad, mundane event into a drama because you're bored. It's a studio. It's full of wires. Things flicker." "But the lozenge wrapper," Charles said around a mouthful of potato. "It was silver. He came in with fishermen's friends. I saw the tin." Frances looked at him with the weary patience of a woman who has spent 30 years dealing with adolescent logic. "So he had 2 types of sweets. Charles, really. Is this why you came? To spin a conspiracy theory so you don't have to think about the fact that you're recording a 600-page book about filing cabinets?" "No," Charles lied. "I came for the company. And the shepherd's pie, which is excellent, by the way." "David made it," Frances said casually. The name landed like a stone in the soup. David, the school inspector. The man who was everything Charles was not. Reliable, solvent, and capable of constructing a shepherd's pie that didn't collapse under its own weight. "Ah," Charles said, his appetite suddenly dimming. "David, how thorough of him." "He's staying over this weekend," Frances continued, returning to her marking. "So if you're planning one of your laundry and crisis visits, you might want to reschedule." Charles felt the familiar pang of jealous arrogance. It was absurd he had walked out on her years ago, but the idea of another man in his kitchen, using his oven, cooking for his wife, was an affront to the natural order of his ego. "I shall be very busy," Charles said stiffly. "The studio schedule is brutal." "Good," Frances said. She looked up again, her eyes softening just a fraction. "But Charles, if you really think something is wrong, look at the paperwork." "Paperwork? You said the light flickered. That means the machine did something. Machines have logs, don't they? In schools, every time someone logs into the server, it's recorded. If someone punched in to hide something, the computer will say so." Charles stopped with the fork, halfway to his mouth. "The session log," he whispered. "Ken's log. It tracks every edit, every stop, every start." "There you go," Frances said, marking a large C- on the essay in front of her. "Logic. Try it sometime. It's very refreshing." Charles finished the pie in silence. He rinsed the plate, because he knew David would have rinsed the plate. "Thank you, Frances," he said, moving to the door. "For the pie and the logic." "Don't get involved, Charles," she called after him, her voice drifting down the hallway. "Read the book, take the check, and try not to get arrested. I have a governor's meeting on Monday, and I don't want to have to bail you out." Charles stepped out into the cool night air of Muswell Hill. The streetlights hummed with suburban stability. Frances was right, of course. She was always right. The booth was a locked room, but the computer was a witness that couldn't be silenced, couldn't be bribed, and, unlike Sir Julian Vane, wouldn't drop dead just when the story got interesting. He walked to the bus stop, his mind racing. He needed to see that log, and he needed to see it before anyone realized that the new narrator was reading more than just the script. Chapter 6. The Billing Illusion. The following morning, Charles arrived at the studio with the terrifying punctuality of an actor who needs the money. It was 8:45. The glass building was still waking up. The receptionist was applying mascara with the precision of a restoration artist working on a fresco, and the corridors hummed with the aggressive silence of corporate industry. Charles had arrived early for two reasons. Firstly, to establish a reputation for professionalism that he intended to squander later in the week. Secondly, to engage in what he preferred to call character research, but which the law would classify as snooping. Studio 3 was unlocked. The lights were dimmed, the equipment hummed in standby, and the smell of stale coffee hung in the air like a depressed ghost. The room was empty. Charles moved to the producer's desk. It was a mess of schedules, coffee cups, and invoices, the paper trail of artistic endeavour. He sifted through the pile, his eyes scanning for names, numbers, or anything that looked like a motive. He found it under a half-eaten packet of digestive biscuits. It was a printed email from the publisher's legal department, addressed to Sheila. The subject line was, "Vane Contract, Completion Threshold." Charles read it. The legalese was dense, but the numbers were stark. Sir Julian Vane's contract stipulated a principal narrator fee of £20,000, payable upon the completion of 51% of the manuscript. If he completed less than 51%, his fee reverted to a daily rate, and the principal narrator credit was voided to allow for a seamless replacement strategy. Charles checked the schedule pinned to the wall. Sir Julian had died in the middle of Chapter 13. According to the page count, Chapter 13 was the tipping point. He had died approximately 3 pages short of the 51% mark. "Good God," Charles whispered. By dying when he did, Sir Julian had saved the production company nearly £15,000 and solved the problem of his billing. He had gone from being an expensive, litigious liability to a cheap, tragic tax write-off. The door buzzer sounded. Charles jumped, shoving the email back under the biscuits. He pulled his phone out just as it began to ring. It was Maurice. Of course it was Maurice. Maurice Skellen possessed a sixth sense for the exact moment his client was doing something illicit. "Charles!" Maurice's voice was a wheeze of excitement. "I've been looking at the contract. Standard Clause 4B. If you perish during the recording, do I still get my commission on the unrecorded hours?" "Good morning to you too, Maurice," Charles whispered, moving away from the desk. "I am currently alive, though the day is young." "Good, good. And the per diems? Have you secured the per diems? You must insist on cash, Charles. Checks have a nasty habit of bouncing when the production wraps early. Maurice, I am about to start reading. I have to go." "Just don't do anything foolish," Maurice advised. "Like acting. Just read the words. And get a receipt for lunch." Charles hung up. The mercenary instincts of his agent were, as always, a grounding force. The door to the control room opened. It wasn't Sheila or Ken. It was Nigel, the rights representative. He looked like a man who had slept in his suit. "Mr. Paris," Nigel said, blinking in the dim light. "You're early." "Eager," Charles corrected. "Just getting the feel of the room." Nigel looked at the desk. He looked at the biscuits. He looked at Charles. There was a twitch in his jaw that suggested a man holding back a scream or a confession. "Sheila will be late," Nigel said tightly. "Tube strike. Ken is parking the car. You might as well get settled." He gestured to the booth. Charles nodded. He walked into the airlock, then into the booth itself. It was exactly as it had been yesterday. The stool, the music stand, the microphone standing like a robotic sentry. But the air was different. It felt heavy, clammy. Charles sat on the stool. He put his headphones on. "Hello?" he said, into the mic. There was no response. The control room was dark on the other side of the glass. Nigel was standing there, his silhouette reflected in the monitor glow. He wasn't sitting at the desk. He was standing by the wall panel, the environmental controls. Charles watched as Nigel reached out and adjusted a dial. Inside the booth, the low hum of the ventilation system stopped. The silence was instant and absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum. "I think the fan is off," Charles said, pressing the talkback button. Nigel didn't move. He just stood there, watching. Charles felt a prickle of unease. He reached for the heavy handle of the booth door. It didn't turn. "It seems to be stuck," Charles said, his voice rising slightly. "Nigel?" Nigel turned his back. He walked out of the control room. Charles was alone. The booth was small, 6 feet by 6 feet, padded with acoustic foam that absorbed sound and, apparently, hope. With the ventilation off, the air began to warm up immediately. It smelled of the room spray he had noticed yesterday, bitter almonds and stale menthol. Charles stood up. He banged on the glass. "This isn't funny," he shouted. The foam ate his voice. To the outside world, he was just a mime trapped in a box. He felt a wave of dizziness. Was it panic? Or was there something in the humidifier? He looked at the black device on the table. It was puffing mist again. A steady, silent stream. He grabbed the humidifier and unplugged it. The mist stopped, but the air was already thick. His chest tightened. He thought of Sir Julian Vane, clutching his throat, the red light flickering off. Farce, Charles thought, his brain feeling sluggish. "I am going to die in a box while reading about timber exports. It is the ultimate farce." He banged on the glass again, harder this time. He looked for a chair to throw, but the stool was bolted to the floor. Of course it was. Actors steal everything. The room began to spin. He slid down the wall, his cheek pressing against the cool glass of the window. Through the blur, he saw the control room door open. Ken walked in, carrying a tray of coffees. He looked at the empty producer's chair. He looked at the dark booth. He looked at Charles, slumped against the glass. Charles saw Ken drop the coffees. The engineer ran to the console and slammed a button. The ventilation roared back to life. A blast of cold, filtered air hit Charles in the face. The door handle turned. The seal broke with a hiss. "Jesus, mate!" Ken was there, grabbing Charles by the arm. "What the hell are you doing?" The maglock was engaged. Did you lean on the panic button? Charles stumbled out, coughing, his lungs grasping for the oxygen of the control room. I didn't touch anything, Charles wheezed, channeling his inner Sir Julian. Nigel. He turned the fan off. He locked it. Nigel? Ken looked around the empty room. Nigel's not here. He texted me. He's stuck in traffic with Sheila. Charles straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked at the door. He looked at the environmental controls. He was here, Charles said firmly. He was standing right there. And he looked at me like I was a budget overrun he wanted to delete. Ken looked at him with a mixture of pity and annoyance. Mate, you're seeing things. It's the nerves. First day. Big shoes to fill. Sit down. Have a coffee. Don't die on me. I haven't got the paperwork for 2 bodies. Charles sat. He took the coffee. His hand was shaking. He knew what he had seen. He knew what he had felt. This wasn't just about saving money on a contract. Someone was protecting the silence. And as the caffeine hit his system, Charles Paris came to a grim realization. He wasn't just the replacement narrator. He was the replacement victim. Chapter 7. Farce in the Booth. Recovery from a near-death experience in the entertainment industry is usually measured in the time it takes to locate a vending machine. Having survived the accidental locking of the booth, Charles Paris sat in the corridor, clutching a plastic cup of coffee that tasted like battery acid, and contemplating his next performance. He had 2 options. Option A, go home, lock the door, and drink until the world softened into a manageable blur. Option B, use the adrenaline currently flooding his system to catch a murderer. He chose option B, largely because he had already spent the advance on paying off his gas bill and couldn't afford to be fired for cowardice. Right, Charles said, standing up and brushing lint from his trousers. He marched back into the control room. Sheila had arrived, looking flustered and carrying a wet umbrella. Nigel was there too, typing furiously on a BlackBerry. Ken was at the desk, looking guilty. Charles, Sheila said. Ken told me about the door. We'll get maintenance on it immediately. A faulty maglock, dreadful health and safety. Indeed, Charles said, adopting the voice of a man who knows where the bodies are buried because he has a map. But actually, Sheila, I'm not worried about the door. I'm worried about the digital footprint. He paused for effect. It was a term he'd heard on a crime drama he'd once auditioned for and failed to get because he looked too trustworthy. The footprint? Sheila asked, her eyes narrowing. The punch-in log, Charles lied smoothly. While I was waiting for air, I noticed Ken's backup drive was active. I've taken a copy of the session data, the real session data. From the moment Sir Julian died, Ken spun around in his chair. You what? You can't just copy files, mate. That's proprietary. It's evidence, Charles said, tapping his coat pocket significantly. I'm going to take it to a friend of mine. Audio forensics expert. Works for the BBC. If there was an edit made while Sir Julian was dying, he'll find it. He saw the look that passed between Sheila and Nigel. It was a look of pure, unadulterated panic, quickly masked by professional concern. Charles, Sheila said, her voice dropping to a soothing register that Charles recognized as producer managing a difficult talent. Let's not be hasty. Forensics? The police have already closed the case. Then they won't mind reopening it, Charles said cheerily. I'm just popping out for a spot of lunch. Maurice insists I eat. I shall return at 2. Don't start without me. He turned and exited the room with a flourish, walking briskly down the corridor until he reached the fire exit. He opened it, let it slam shut, and then immediately tiptoed back. The control room had a large storage cupboard near the entrance, used for housing spare mic stands, tangles of XLR cables, and the crushed dreams of interns. Charles slipped inside, pulling the door almost shut, leaving a crack the width of a coin. It was a mistake. The cupboard was smaller than it looked. Charles found himself wedged between a stack of heavy flight cases and a forest of microphone stands that seemed determined to poke him in every available rib. A coil of cable was pressing into his lower back, and the air smelled of stale rubber and dust. Farce, Charles thought, trying to shift his weight without knocking over a cymbal stand. I am a 50-year-old man hiding in a cupboard. This is not how Poirot did it. Through the crack, he could hear the conversation in the control room. It had changed tone completely. The professional veneer had vanished, replaced by the sharp, jagged edges of conspiracy. He's got the file. Sheila. Nigel's voice was high and tight. If he sees the timestamp on the punch-in, we are finished. He's bluffing. Sheila's voice. Harder. Colder. He's an actor. They lie for a living. He doesn't know how to read a raw data log. He probably thinks a waveform is a type of haircut. But if he takes it to someone who does? Ken asked. Look, I deleted the audio of the gasp, like you said. I smoothed the room tone. But the system log, that's hard-coded. I can't wipe the record event without reformatting the whole drive. Then reformat it, Sheila snapped. I can't. We lose the book. We lose the Pringle biography. Better we lose the book than go to prison, you idiot. Charles held his breath. He shifted slightly, and the base of a microphone stand dug sharply into his kidney. He bit his lip to stop a yelp. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Nigel whined. You said it would be clean. You said the lozenge would just simulate a stroke. A medical event. To trigger the insurance. He was going to ruin us! Nigel! Sheila sounded furious. He found the accounting error. He knew we were skimming the completion bonuses. He was going to the press. Do you know what happens to a producer who steals from a national treasure? You don't get to work on Peppa Pig, let alone Penguin Classics. So we killed him, Ken said flatly, with a cyanide lozenge. We accelerated his retirement, Sheila corrected. And now this washed-up understudy is waving a USB stick around. We need to get it back. He's coming back at 2. We wait. We invite him into the booth. We tell him we need to check levels. And then what? Then we make sure he has an accident. A real one this time. A loose heavy light fixture? A frayed cable? The studio is a dangerous place, Ken. Charles felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. This wasn't just fraud. This was premeditated murder, discussed with the casual practicality of a production meeting. He needed to get out. He needed to get to the police. He tried to shift his leg, which had gone to sleep. His foot caught the leg of a cymbal stand. Clang. The sound was small, but in the acoustically treated silence of the studio, it sounded like a gunshot. Silence in the control room. What was that? Sheila asked. Came from the cupboard, Ken said. Charles froze. He tried to shrink, to become one with the flight cases. Footsteps approached, heavy, deliberate. The cupboard door was yanked open. Light flooded in, blinding Charles. He squinted up to see Sheila standing there. She didn't look like a producer anymore. She looked like someone who had calculated the cost of a human life and found it affordable. Well, Sheila said, looking down at Charles, who was tangled in cables and clutching a boom arm like a security blanket. I see the resting actor is working hard. I was looking for a prop, Charles stammered, trying to extricate himself. For character. Grab him, Sheila said to Ken. Ken hesitated. Sheila, grab him. He heard everything. Ken lunged. Charles, driven by the desperate energy of the coward, threw the cymbal stand. It clattered into Ken's shins. Ken yelled and hopped back. Charles scrambled out of the cupboard on all fours, scrambling like a crab escaping a boiling pot. He hit the floor, rolled, and knocked over the producer's desk chair. "Stop him!" Nigel screamed, but made no effort to move, staying true to the rights representative's code of avoiding physical labor. Charles made for the door. Sheila blocked his path, wielding a heavy metal clipboard like a weapon. "You're not going anywhere, Charles," she hissed. "We have a session to finish." "I resign!" Charles shouted. He grabbed the nearest object, a pot of lukewarm coffee, and threw the liquid in her direction. Sheila shrieked and ducked. It was enough. Charles barged past her, his shoulder checking her into the wall, and burst into the corridor. He didn't look back. He ran. He ran past the platinum discs, past the gold discs, and past the receptionist, who didn't even look up as he sprinted by, panting like a steam engine. He hit the glass doors and burst out into the cold air of the street. He didn't stop running until he was 3 streets away, his lungs burning, his coat flapping, and his dignity entirely absent. He found a pub. Not the soundboard, a different one that looked like it didn't ask questions. He stumbled to the bar. "A large Bell's," Charles gasped, leaning heavily on the wood. "And do you have a phone? I need to call the police. And possibly my agent." He downed the whiskey in one gulp. The farce was over. The threat was real. And he had realized one terrifying thing. He had forgotten to actually steal the data log. He had nothing but his word. And in show business, that wasn't worth the paper it wasn't written on. Chapter 8. Actor Logic, Edit Logic. It is a well-known fact in the theatrical profession that the show must go on. It is a less well-known fact that this rule applies even when the producers have just tried to murder the leading man with a clipboard. Charles Paris sat in the corner of the Queen's Head, a pub sufficiently far from the studio to avoid immediate pursuit, but close enough to maintain a sense of geographical continuity. He was nursing a large Bell's and staring at his phone. He had called the police. The conversation had been dispiriting. The desk sergeant had listened to Charles's breathless account of poisoned lozenges, punch-in edits, and homicidal producers with the weary skepticism reserved for people who claimed to have seen Elvis in a chip shop. Without physical evidence which Charles had failed to secure, it was just a civil dispute with dramatic overtones. Charles realized, with a sinking sensation, that he was going to have to direct the final scene himself. He needed to get back into that studio. He needed to make them panic. And he needed to do it while ensuring he didn't end up as a bonus track on the Best of Sir Julian Vane memorial album. He finished his whiskey, felt the familiar artificial courage warm his blood, and dialed Sheila's number. "Charles?" Her voice was tight, dangerous. "Where are you?" "I'm in a pub, Sheila," Charles said, adopting the tone of a man who has reconsidered his life choices and found them lacking in financial security. "I've been thinking about what I saw, and about my bank balance. I realized I may have overreacted," Charles lied. "I'm an actor, darling. We're prone to hysteria. The thing is, I really need this fee. And Morris has already spent his commission. So, here is my proposition. I come back. I finish the book. You pay me. And whatever happened to Sir Julian, well, that's between him and his maker." There was a long silence on the line. Charles could almost hear Sheila calculating the risk. If she refused, the book was dead, the money was lost, and the fraud would be exposed. If she agreed, she got her product, and she could always arrange for Charles to have a fatal accident after he'd read the final chapter. "Come back," Sheila said. "We have a deadline." Walking back into the studio felt like walking into a lion's den, if the lion were wearing a Prada suit and holding a cost report. The atmosphere in the control room was brittle. Sheila stood by the producer's desk, her face a mask of enforced calm. Nigel was pacing in the corner, looking like a man who was allergic to his own conscience. Ken sat at the mixing desk, staring at his screens with the sullen intensity of a teenager grounded for murder. "Charles," Sheila said, "so glad you could join us. Chapter 14? "Chapter 14, Charles agreed. "The twilight years." He walked into the booth. The heavy door clicked shut. He sat on the stool. The air still smelled faintly of the bitter almond spray, though someone had clearly tried to mask it with a heavy dose of floral air freshener. The result smelled like a funeral parlour. Charles put on his headphones. He adjusted the mic. Rolling, Ken's voice came through the cans, flat, emotionless. Charles began to read. He read about Archibald Pringle's retirement to the coast. He read about the letters to the Times. He read with the smooth, professional detachment of a man who is waiting for the police to arrive. He had, of course, made one other phone call from the pub, not to the police, but to Maurice. "Maurice," he had said, "call the studio. Ask for Sheila. Tell her you've just had a call from Scotland Yard. Tell them I sent a courier with a hard drive this morning. Just drop it into conversation." Now, Charles watched through the glass. He saw the phone on the producer's desk light up. He saw Sheila answer it. He saw the colour drain from her face. Charles kept reading. Pringle's correspondence reveals a man deeply concerned with the legacy he would leave behind. Sheila slammed the phone down. She turned to Nigel. She was shouting, though Charles couldn't hear the words through the soundproofing. She pointed at Ken. She pointed at the hard drive sitting on the desk, the master drive. The trap was sprung. In the logic of a murderer, evidence is the only enemy. If they thought the police were coming for the files, their instinct would be to destroy the source. Ken reached for the drive. Nigel grabbed his arm. They were arguing. Charles stopped reading. "Is everything all right?" he asked into the mic. "I'm sensing a little tension in the control room." Sheila spun around to face the glass. Her eyes were wild. She pressed the talkback button. "You bastard," she hissed. "You didn't send anything. You were in the cupboard." "Was I?" Charles asked, his voice magnified by the speakers. "Or did I make a copy while you were arguing about the cyanide? You know, actors are very good at props. We notice things. Like the fact that Sir Julian's humidifier is currently in your bag, Sheila." Sheila's hand went instinctively to her oversized tote bag. "Ken!" she screamed. "Wipe it! Wipe the drive! Format the whole thing!" "I can't!" Ken yelled back, his voice audible even through the glass now. "The system is locked while we're rolling." "Then smash it." It was the moment of blocking Charles had anticipated. The panic. The physical scramble. Sheila lunged for the mixing desk. She grabbed the external hard drive, a sleek black box blinking with blue light, and raised it high, intending to bring it down on the edge of the console. Charles didn't wait. He kicked the booth door open. "Don't!" he shouted, stepping out into the control room. "That's a classic error. Never destroy the prop until the curtain falls." Sheila swung around, the hard drive raised like a weapon. "You ruin everything!" she screamed. "He was dead anyway. He was sick. We just helped him along. He was going to bankrupt the company." "So you poisoned a national treasure to save your quarterly bonus?" Charles asked, stepping closer. "That's a very poor motivation, darling. It lacks depth." "Get him, Nigel," Sheila ordered. Nigel, to his credit, looked at Charles, looked at Sheila, and then looked at the door. He made a rapid calculation of his own survival odds. I need the bathroom," Nigel squeaked, and bolted for the exit. "Useless!" Sheila shrieked. She threw the hard drive at Charles. Charles ducked. The drive sailed over his head and smashed into the wall, cracking open and spilling its plastic guts onto the carpet. "That," Ken said mournfully, "was the backup." Sheila didn't care. She grabbed a microphone, stand a heavy, cast-iron base with a long metal pole. She advanced on Charles. "I will edit you out, Charles Paris," she snarled. "I will fade you to black." Charles backed up until he hit the console. He was trapped. He was 50 years old, slightly drunk, and being threatened by a woman in a silk blouse wielding audio equipment. "Sheila," Charles said, holding up his hands. "Think about the reviews. Producer kills second narrator. It's repetitive. It's derivative." She swung. Charles flinched. He closed his eyes, expecting the blow. It never came. There was a loud crash as the control room door was kicked open. "Police!" a voice bellowed. "Drop the... whatever that is." Sheila froze, the mic stand hovering in midair. Standing in the doorway were 2 uniformed officers and the bored detective from the day before. Behind them, peering anxiously over their shoulders, was Maurice Skellen. "I told them!" Maurice shouted, pointing a shaking finger. "I told them my client was being held hostage, and I insisted on a location fee for the arrest." The detective stepped forward, looking at the scene. The smashed hard drive, the terrified engineer, the woman brandishing a microphone stand, and Charles Paris, leaning against the mixing desk and trying to look like he had everything under control. "Sheila Hancock?" the detective asked. "We've had a call about a discrepancy in the toxicology report for Sir Julian Vane. Something about almond residue?" Sheila lowered the stand. The fight went out of her. She slumped, looking suddenly very small and very tired. "It was the humidifier," she whispered. "We put it in the water tank. It was supposed to look like asthma." "Right," the detective said, pulling out his cuffs. "You're nicked. And you," he pointed at Ken. "Don't touch that computer." Charles let out a long breath. He looked at Maurice. "You called them?" Charles asked. "Of course. Maurice said, adjusting his cravat. "You told me to lie about a courier. I thought that sounded far too complicated, so I just called the police and told them you were about to be murdered. Much more direct. Besides, I couldn't let you die, Charles. You haven't signed the commission agreement for this job yet." Charles smiled. He looked at the smashed hard drive on the floor. "Well," Charles said, dusting off his jacket, "that's a wrap, I suppose." "Not quite," Ken said from the desk. He was pointing at the screen. "We're still rolling." Charles looked. The red light was still on. The system had captured the entire confession, clear as a bell, in high-definition audio. Charles leaned over the desk and pressed the stop button. "Now," Charles said, "it's a wrap." Chapter 9. Resting Unabridged. The entertainment industry possesses a digestive system that would be the envy of a shark. It swallows scandals, tragedies, and human debris, digests them instantly, and swims on without breaking its rhythm. The biography of Archibald Pringle was, in the parlance of the trade, indefinitely postponed. This was a polite way of saying that the publishers had decided that a book narrated by a murdered national treasure and finished by a man who had brawled with the producer in a control room was perhaps not the Christmas bestseller they had envisaged. Charles Paris received a polite email from the new production team, a group of people who had been drafted in to sanitize the operation. They thanked him for his valuable contribution to the judicial process and enclosed a cheque for a kill fee, a term Charles found tasteless given the circumstances, but cashed immediately nonetheless. The recording was scrapped. The studio was booked for a pop group. The memory of Sir Julian Vane was honoured with a 2-minute silence on Radio 4, and then everyone went back to work. 2 days later, Charles was back in Hereford Road. The gas meter was hungry again. The room was cold. The silence was not the expensive, treated silence of a studio, but the heavy, damp silence of unemployment. He was resting. Again, the phone rang. It was Maurice. "Charles, dear boy." Maurice sounded buoyant. "I've just had the statement from the publisher. The kill fee. I've deducted my commission, of course, and a small handling charge for the trauma of witnessing your arrest. I trust that's acceptable?" "I wasn't arrested, Maurice. The murderer was. Detail, Charles. Mere detail. The point is, you are available, and I have news." Charles sat on the edge of the bed, wrapping the duvet around his shoulders like a royal cape. "News? A casting. Very exciting. It's a voice job. They heard about your involvement with the Vane affair and thought you had the right texture." "Is it an audiobook?" Charles asked, a flicker of hope igniting against his better judgment. "Not exactly," Maurice wheezed. "It's for a pharmaceutical company. They need a voice for the side effects disclaimer at the end of a radio commercial for a new antifungal cream. You know the sort of thing. May cause dizziness, nausea, and existential dread. They need someone who can read very fast, but still sound reassuring." "Antifungal cream?" Charles repeated flatly. "It's national radio, Charles. The residuals could be in the high 2 figures. I told them you were interested." Charles looked at the grey window. He looked at the unwashed teacup on the floor. He looked at the stack of bills on the mantelpiece. "I'll take it," Charles said. "Excellent. Tuesday at 10. Soho. Don't be late. And Charles?" "Yes, Maurice? Try not to solve any crimes this time. It plays havoc with the schedule." Maurice hung up. Charles put the phone down. He stood up and dressed with the slow deliberation of a man preparing for battle. He put on his coat, checked his pockets for the front door key, and walked out into the biting November wind. He didn't go to the tube station. He walked around the corner to the Montrose, his local sanctuary. The pub was empty, save for a few regulars who looked like part of the furniture. The air smelled of hops and history. Charles approached the bar. The landlord, a man who had seen Charles through 3 decades of fluctuating fortunes, nodded in greeting. "The usual? Mr. Paris?" "Please," Charles said. He watched the golden liquid fill the glass. A large bells, the colour of optimism, or at least the colour of a very good anaesthetic. He picked up the glass and held it to the light. He thought about Sir Julian Vane, edited out of existence. He thought about Sheila, editing her own morality to fit a spreadsheet. He thought about the recording that was still sitting on a police server somewhere, the only performance of his career that was undeniable, uneditable truth. Life, Charles reflected, was a series of bad takes. There were no punch-ins. You couldn't roll back and fix the stutter, the hesitation, or the moment you walked out on your wife. You just had to keep reading the script until the lights went out. He took a sip. The whiskey burned, warm and familiar. It was the only room tone he needed. "Cheers," Charles whispered to the empty room. He put the glass down, checked his watch, and wondered if he had time for another before he went back to the bedsit to rehearse the side effects of antifungal cream. He decided he probably did. And that brings us to the end of Dead on the Mic. If you enjoyed this excursion into the cutthroat world of audio recording, please do leave a like. It helps the algorithm find us, much like a good agent finding work for a difficult client. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. We have many more mysteries to solve, from the dressing rooms of the West End to the grim reality of corporate video. Until next time, keep your headphones on, watch your back, and remember, if the red light is on, someone is always listening. Good night.